Welcome back, everyone. Spring and summer is a time for new growth and taking bold action together. So we hope these stories can inspire you to live boldly, take wise chances, and with our friends and family, make a difference together. Today we will be reading The Adventures of Wishbone, Digging to the Center of the Earth by Michael Anthony Steele, inspired by A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. So lean in with a spirit of adventure, grab a friend, and let's enjoy the story together. Chapter 5. Professor Linnenbrock watched as Axel slowly lowered himself down into the darkness below. The dim light glowing from the Ruhmkorff coil lantern hanging from Axel's belt lit up a small circle of rock near where he descended. Professor thought they were very lucky to have the Ruhmkorff coils. They were a special lamp invented by the chemist M. Ruhmkorff. They did not use oil or gas, but electricity. Each came with its own battery. The coil could easily be worn on a climber's sturdy belt. Carrying the coils was much easier than traveling around with a big heavy supply of lamp oil. Although the professor couldn't see Hans, he calculated the guide stood waiting on a ledge about 200 feet below the one where he was at. Both Professor and Hans had turned their lamps off, that way they could save battery power and also avoid blinding Axel during his descent. Professor Linnenbrock was very happy to be away from Iceland's cold wind. The temperature of the volcano's interior was more regular and also comfortable. No sudden blasts of wind would hit them there. Even the ice that had built up on his fur had melted away soon after they had begun their trek into the shaft's darkness. Together, the three travelers had been descending into Saknussem's dark pit at about 200 feet at a time. In between each descent, they rested. The longest rope they had was 400 feet. In order to rescue the rope, they had looped the center of it around a sturdy rock outcropping. That left two equal lengths of rope, each slightly less than 200 feet long, to dangle in the darkness. Hans and Axel had then descended by holding onto both lengths of the rope. The professor used a somewhat different method. When Axel and Hans had reached each new ledge below, they would then lower down the professor. "Uncle," came Axel's voice down from below. "I'm on the ledge," he shouts, bounced off the sides of the tunnel's shaft and up to the professor's keen ears. "Very well," Professor Linnenbrock answered. "Slowly pull on one end of the rope." The professor turned on his lamp. It lit a section of the deep hole. He looked down and watched as the rope slid around a large rock sticking out from the ledge he was standing on. When the end of the rope came into view, the professor called to Axel to stop pulling. He cautiously took a short end of the rope into his mouth and grasped it hard between his teeth. "You want to lay down? You lay down." Let's see. Pulling the rope tightly around the rock, the professor turned his body around with his back facing the hole and slowly began to step backward off the ledge. That would be a talent for a dog to be able to do that. His front paws dug into the top of the ledge as his hind legs began to feel their way backward down the rock wall. "All right, Axel," the professor yelled. The rope in his mouth made him slur his words. "Lower me down!" Below, he could hear Hans and Axel's hand slide along the tightened rope as he continued to walk backwards down the rocky slope. Can you see this figure? So cute. Just like puppers. Above him, he could hear the rope slide against the rocks. Bits of dirt and stone fell onto his head from above, but his grip was strong as a bear trap, and he held on tightly as his guide and nephew slowly lowered him down to the next ledge. For 9 more hours, they repeated the same movements, each time. "Just lay down, pups. You're good. There you go. It's too hot to have the blanket, so you're going to have to deal." Each time the opening they had entered slowly shrank away until it was just a small dot above them. Slowly they approached the bottom of the giant pit. Doo-doo-boo. At the beginning of their descent, only the professor's keen hearing could pick up any sort of noise. Now they all could clearly hear the stones and lava that they knocked loose hit the hard floor of the pit below. As the last stone fell... my legs are unacceptable to you. Okay. Love you. Oh. I left a present. Let's see. As the last stone fell, it was clear to Professor Lindenbrock that they were on the final edge. Professor backed down the steep wall one last time. His nails scraped at the hard surface. As he moved, he calculated the distance they had descended into Mount Snuffles. They had shifted the rope 28 times, and their doubled rope had been almost 200 feet long. 28 times 200 feet equaled a total of 5,600 feet. They had descended more than a mile into the shaft. When Professor Lindenbrock was just a few feet above the bottom of the pit, he pushed away from the wall with all fours. As rope swung away from the side, the professor loosened his jaws. He released his tight grip on the rope and let himself drop neatly to the ground. He looked up at his nephew. "We have reached the end of our journey," he said. Hans didn't seem to pay attention. He just gathered the rope. However, Axel's face lit up with excitement and wonder. "We have? You mean we've reached the interior of the earth?" he asked. Professor Lindenbrock sighed. It was clear their amazing descent had not raised Axel's spirits. "No, Axel," Professor replied. "We have reached the bottom of this giant well." "And I suppose we can go no further?" he asked hopefully. Professor Lindenbrock turned a slow circle. His lamp threw a small circle of light across the bottom of the pit. As Professor turned, the light lit up nothing but the hardened lava wall. But finally the light came to rest over the entrance of a dark tunnel. Its opening was visible for just a few feet before it turned sharply to the right. "Look there, Axel!" Professor exclaimed. "There before you is a tunnel and the next leg of our journey." Oh yeah, he's going to be thrilled about that. He turned from facing the tunnel to look at Axel. Hans was now packing the rope into his knapsack. "In any event, we must see about that tomorrow. We have spent the entire day climbing down 200 feet at a time. Let us now eat and have a good night's rest." 3 travelers ate a light supper. Then each did his best to make a bed among the pile of stones, dirt, and lava that had gathered through the years at the bottom of the volcano's shaft. The professor watched as Hans cleared away the area, then laid his blanket over the hard surface. Axel stretched himself over some ropes and clothes they had thrown down earlier. Each seemed eager for sleep after a long day's work. Professor Lindenbrock made some notations in a leather-bound book he carried and then curled up snugly on his blanket. He turned his gaze upward towards the top of the long shaft. A single brilliant star shone through the small opening at the top. It was as if he were looking through a giant telescope. Professor made a few calculations in his head. He believed it was a star from the constellation of the Little Bear. After doing his little bit of astronomy, Professor Lindenbrock fell into a sound sleep. The next morning, the 3 travelers awoke inside the dark shaft. Hans switched on his lamp and handed out food and water. Everyone ate a light breakfast of biscuits and dried meat. In between mouthfuls of biscuit, Professor Lindenbrock turned to Axel. "Well, Axel, my boy," he said, "what say you now? Did you ever spend a more peaceful night in our house in Hamburg?" He looked around the cavern. "No deafening sounds of cartwheels, no yelling from cats at all hours?" "Well, Uncle," Axel replied, "it is truly very quiet at the bottom of this well." He took a sip of water from his canteen and continued, "But to me there is something alarming in all this calm." "Why, one would say you were nervous," the professor said, finishing off the last bit of his breakfast. "Did you know that as yet we have not gone even 1 inch into the depths of the puzzle of the earth?" Axel looked puzzled. "What can you mean, sir?" Okay, can the little fire be helpful? No. Is that good? There we go. Where do we leave off, Dave? You gotta tell me. You said puzzled. "I mean to say," the professor answered, "that we have only just reached the bottom of the island of Iceland. This long vertical tube, which begins at the crater of Sniffles — I don't think the book needs lit, thank you — each roughly at sea level." "Are you sure, Uncle?" Axel asked. "Absolutely," the professor replied, looking at his notes. "Sniffles is about a mile high, and we have plunged just over a mile into its stomach." The professor stood. "Now that we have had our breakfast, let us quickly be on our way." The professor placed his blanket in his knapsack. Meanwhile, Hans and Axel packed their own gear. Then they divided equally the remaining supplies and equipment. Everyone had their packs on their backs. Hans and Axel held their pickaxes in their hands. Then the 3 travelers switched on their lamps and walked towards the tunnel entrance. I don't know if you could hear that. That was a big sigh. I guess we don't need our little fire. Fine. Now, Axel, the professor said enthusiastically, we are about to take our first step into the interior of the Earth. Hans led the way. Professor went next, followed by Axel. The passage winded around and down into the earth. Professor Lindenbrock stepped closer to the tunnel's wall to get a better look at what it was made of. The light from his lamp bounced off the deep black walls and pierced into its many small dark holes. Some parts of the wall looked like Swiss cheese. The professor believed that long ago a stream of fiery lava flowing from the earth's long core had carved a passageway through the tunnel. The hardened lava now lined the inside of the tunnel with its thick coating. The tunnel itself was just a bit wider than the hallways in the professor's house back in Hamburg. Looking through the tunnel was not at all like looking down the stairway to his house. Well, yeah. The tunnel was generally not that steep. Nevertheless, it did appear to be leading gradually downward. At some points, however, the passageway was very steep. Once again, the group had to tie a length of rope between them and help one another make their way down the slope. Most of the passageway, however, was little more than a leisurely stroll. Large holes in the hardened lava ground often served as steps. It was as if they were leading the travelers slowly down into a dark basement. As the three made their way, the tunnel widened and the scenery became much more interesting. Long ago, the professor guessed the tunnel had been filled with moisture. Water dripping from the ceiling carried with it small amounts of calcium. The calcium deposits would over many years build up into large stalactites. They looked like giant icicles made of rock. Directly below some of them, upside-down rock icicles called stalagmites grew upward from the ground. So stalactites from the ceiling, stalagmites from the ground. They were formed as extra calcium in the water dripped off the tips of the stalactite directly overhead. All around the trio, the light from their lamps refracted and reflected off the many crystals jutting out of the solidified lava. That lava existed in a whole range of colors, from reddish brown to pale yellow. When the light would strike the tunnel's walls, the crystals themselves would glow. Okay. Another picture. So cute. It thrilled Professor Lindenbrock to watch Axel examine each mineral display with a complete sense of joy. He used his pickaxe to chip away small samples. Then he placed them in the specimen bag he kept slung about his neck. It seemed that Axel had forgotten his fears, at least for a moment. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the wonderful possibilities of this trip. Professor Lindenbrock believed Axel's sense of discovery should be encouraged. Wait until we advance further, Axel, as the professor spoke. Oh yeah, remind him you have so much further to go. That'll really help. As the professor spoke, his voice echoed off the solidified lava. What we have discovered up until now is nothing. Onward, my boy, onward! With Hans in the lead, the three travelers descended deeper into the lava-carved tunnel. They trekked all of that day. Even though the tunnel always led further downward, they never seemed to make their way out of the lava tube. They were still surrounded by the hard rock. The professor had believed that the soft dirt would surely wait for them below the ancient volcano. About 8 o'clock in the evening, Professor Lindenbrock gave the signal to halt. They had made great progress, reaching a depth of 10,000 feet below sea level. They stopped inside a large caravan the size of a great ballroom. Each hung his lamp into an outcropping of rock in the lava wall. Okay. Wow, you're very dramatic tonight. Yeah, good thing my reflexes are quick as a cat. Let's see. Where were we, Jade? Before you threw yourself off of my lap. Okay. They stopped inside a large cavern the size of a great ball. Each hung his lamp onto an outcropping of rock in the lava wall. The long, unending march into the earth had once again made the travelers tired and hungry. It was clear from Axel's look of relief that he was glad his uncle had declared the day's journey over. Hans began to unpack their supplies. Then he laid out onto a block of lava what was to be their dinner. Each ate in silence. As Professor Lindenbrock chewed his food with pleasure, he watched Axel. He too enjoyed the rest of his food, but after Axel had taken a sip from his canteen, the same troubled look the professor had grown so used to seeing returned to his nephew's face. "What's the matter, dear boy?" he asked between mouthfuls. "Does your dinner not suit you?" Axel looked at Hans, who was sitting and eating in his usual manner, relaxed and quiet. Then Axel turned his gaze to his uncle. "I'm quite uneasy that we certainly do not have enough water to last for more than a few days," he said, placing the cork back into his canteen. "Is that all?" Professor asked. They said, "Don't worry on the matter. I still believe we shall find plenty of water. In fact, far more than we shall want." "But when?" Axel asked. "When we finally get past this layer of lava crust," Professor replied. "How can you expect springs to force their way through these solid stone walls?" Axel just stared at his uncle. The three quietly finished their dinner and went to sleep. For 5 more days, the group traveled through the tunnel of lava. On the third day, Professor Lindenbrock placed Hans in charge of dividing up their food. They had enough supplies to last for several months, with one big exception. The professor had counted on finding underwater streams soon after their journey began, so the travelers had not packed much water. On the 5th day, they had used up the last few mouthfuls of their supply. However, Professor Lindenbrock was not going to give up on his quest, no matter that his dry throat burned or his weak muscles ached. He was determined to continue onward. He tried to ignore the fact that his dehydrated body told him to stop. Even his nose had been dry for the past 2 days. Nothing, however, was going to keep him from following Sagnussem's path. Several times Axel tried to make his uncle reconsider his quest. However, any argument on Axel's part was ignored. Any reason he gave for turning back fell on his uncle's deaf, furried ears. The professor was disappointed to see that Axel's courage ran dry along with his water supply. For the next 2 days, the weary travelers continued down the dark, stony corridor. Still, all that surrounded them was the hard, solidified lava. Their pace had slowed considerably. They had to stop and rest more often. Finally, on the 8th day of their underground trek, Axel could take no more. The passage had taken them upward, downward, and then in a horizontal direction, then downward again. Although Hans seemed hardly affected by the lack of water and the professor's progress was merely slowed, Axel had dropped to his knees and had fallen forward, panting a little, his tongue hanging from his open mouth. Professor Lindenbrock walked to where his nephew lay and gently rolled him over. Axel opened his eyes and sat up. "Poor boy," the professor said. "Reach into my pack." Axel did as his uncle said. He pulled a small flask from the pack. "Drink, dear nephew," the professor said quietly. "The very last mouthful. I saved it for you in an emergency." He walked as Axel put the mouth of this flask next to his cracked lips and slowly drank the last few drops. "Yes, my dear boy," the professor continued. "I knew that if you would fall down half dead, this last drop of water would revive you." "Thank you, dear uncle," Axel replied. "Thank you from my heart." After the last few drops trickled into Axel's mouth, he placed the small flask back in the professor's pack and stood. "Well," Axel said with joy, "there could be no doubt now as to what we have to do." The professor's heart soared. He knew, "Ooh, the walls are shaking." Oh, a little helicopter action. Axel continued, "Water has completely failed us. Our journey is therefore at an end. Let us end the journey at once." The professor's heart dropped like a stone. "Go back?" he questioned surprisingly. "Yes," Axel responded. "We must not lose a single moment. May heaven give us strength for us once more to revisit the light of day." Professor Lindenbrock could not believe what he was hearing. "So, my dear Axel," he said, "those few drops of water have not restored your energy and courage?" "Courage?" Axel exclaimed. "You're not discouraged, sir?" Professor was totally surprised by the question. "What?" he cried. "And give up just as we are on the verge of success?" He placed his 2 front paws onto Axel's legs. "Never, never shall it be said that Professor Lindenbrock retreated." Axel, back to the smooth stone wall, slowly slid down until he was sitting. A look of complete hopelessness washed over his face. "Then we must make up our minds to die," he said with a sigh. Professor Lindenbrock placed a paw on Axel's hand. "No, Axel, certainly not," he said quietly. "Go back. Leave me. I don't want you to be hurt." Professor pawed Axel's hand very slowly in an attempt to comfort Axel. It had no effect. "Take Hans with you. I will go on alone." "You ask us to leave you?" Axel asked, dumbfounded. Professor Lindenbrock stepped back and turned away from Axel. "Leave me, I say. I was the one who decided to undertake this dangerous adventure. I will continue to the end, or I will never return to the surface of Mother Earth." He faced Axel once again. "Go, Axel, once more. I say to you, go." It's like a Air Bud Free Willy situation. Just go. He watched as Axel said nothing. The young man just looked towards the hard ground. Professor Linnenbrock's eyes left Axel in search of their guide. However, he was nowhere to be seen. Professor looked down the tunnel behind them and then up ahead of them. Not even the glow from Hans's lamp could be seen. He turned back to Axel. "Where's Hans?" Professor asked. Then, as if his question had been answered, he heard the distant sound of footsteps, boots running on solid rock. He turned to face the tunnel ahead of him after he made out a distant, dim light. Now the footsteps were close enough for Axel to hear. He, too, turned to face the lighted path. He slowly stood. The glow of the light and sound of the footsteps grew finally. Hans came into full view. As soon as he saw the other two travelers watching, he yelled, "Vatten!" "What?" Axel asked, sounding as if he were in a daze. "Vatten! Vatten!" Hans repeated with the most excitement he had shown during the entire journey. Axel turned to the professor. "What is he saying?" Professor Linnebrock looked proudly at Axel. "He said water." Hans motioned for the other two to follow. Axel and the professor quickly ran after him with renewed strength. Together they ran down the long tunnel for about 100 yards. Then Professor Linnebrock began to hear a dull sound, like that of a distant waterfall. "Hans is right," he said enthusiastically. "That is a low rumble of either a torrent or a flood." Well, yeah, that's maybe not the best thing when you're underground. Axel's face lit up with joy. Everyone's pace quickened. "There's not the slightest doubt about it," the professor continued. "An underground river is flowing right near us." As they progressed, the roar became louder and louder, finally almost deafening. Then, as they kept running, the roar began to fade. It was clear they were passing their only chance for survival. Hans suddenly stopped. Then he began to move back the way they had come. When he had reached the spot where the roar seemed to be the loudest, he placed an ear to the wall. It was obvious to the professor that the guide was looking for the exact spot where the noise of the torrent was loudest. When he had found what he was looking for, the Icelander took the pickaxe from his belt and began to strike the wall with controlled patience. It wasn't long before a welcome bubbling was heard. Through the hole Hans had made, a jet of water burst with such force that it struck the opposite wall of the tunnel. Axel plunged his hand directly into the stream, only to pull it back in pain. "Boiling!" he cried, turning to the professor. Professor Linnebrock trotted over to a small puddle that had already been formed on the tunnel's floor. "Well, never mind," he said. "It will soon cool off against the cold ground." The tunnel began to fill with clouds of vapor, while a small stream flowed off onto the interior of the earth. Soon everyone gathered around the professor in the small puddle. All three travelers bent and lapped away at the cool water. The only way to drink, the professor thought. After they had drunk all they could, everyone filled their canteens. "Perhaps we should try to close this hole so the water does not run out completely," Axel said, as he replaced the cork in his canteen. "Why must we go through such trouble?" the professor asked. Then he answered his own question. "When our canteens are empty, we are not at all sure that we will be able to fill them again when where we will be. Plus, I don't think the water source will dry up." "I think you're correct," Axel replied. "Well then," the professor continued, "let this water run. It will of course run downward, the same path we're following. It will serve to guide and refresh us." A smile rose from Axel's lips. "I think the idea is a good one," he said. "In fact, since Hans discovered this underground river, let us name it after him. That is the usual custom of explorers." "Splendid idea, dear nephew," the professor said. He pulled out his book, wrote a few notes, and returned the book to his pack. "Hans River it is." Professor Linnebrock looked over to Hans. Having had his fill of water, he had seated himself on a rock with his usual calm manner. Somehow he seemed not a bit more proud than he was before. "And with Hans River as our companion," Axel continued, "there's no further reason why we should not succeed in our marvelous adventure." "Ah, my boy," Professor Linnebrock laughed as happiness filled him. "After all, you are coming around." He turned to gaze at Hans and then back to Axel. "Then let us continue on our most incredible journey." That does it for chapter 6, and we'll see you soon for that's it for chapter 5. We'll see you again for chapter 6.